Hello and welcome to another session of Groundbreakers Live. I'm your host Javed Mohammed, and I'm very honored to have with us Connor McDonald, who is an Oracle developer advocate. Connor, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Javed. It's good to be here. Obviously, I wish normally we'd be doing these face-to-face, literally face-to-face, but this will have to do.
Okay. So you have a presentation on the Yatra tour, the rise and fall and rise again of the SQL database. So is that kind of something like history repeating itself, or like what's going on there?
I was motivated to do this talk because I gave a similar presentation in Portugal last year when we were still attending events, and it was actually a group of graduates about an introduction to database technology. And at the end of it, some of the lecturers who actually taught the database units over there said to me, you know, a lot of that history I never knew myself. So I figured there was probably a talk that would be useful for even those who are regular practitioners with databases. So I called it the rise and fall and rise again, really by just going back and looking at the history of database management systems, right back to when there wasn't even data. I started with one of the first commercial computers called the ABC. I think it's the Antonosoft Berry computer, I think.
Wow,
and it was,
I've not heard of that.
Yeah, and so it was that rudimentary that it didn't have data. You actually fed instructions into the memory. It did a calculation and the results came out. There was no concept even of storing data. It was simply a transient thing. You could think of it as a very, very impressive calculator. And then I moved on to the sort of advent of storage. And in the early days, that was literally tape. Disk drives didn't really exist. And then it moved on to the first disk drives and the first data management systems. It always gets a bit of a chuckle when you show the picture of one of the first disk drives. It's 5 megabytes and it's being loaded onto an aircraft like a fridge. You know, the old days of the terabyte SD card sitting on the fingertip now was a distant, or people never thought we'd ever get to that. But the thing there with data management systems was the very, very first data management systems were pretty much key value stores. You could have a key and you would do a read and get all your data. And then as people realized the limitations or the complexities of having to write a lot of code to deal with just such a rudimentary system, we went on to things like ISAM and DL1 and hierarchical data management stores, which were generally accessed by COBOL, because the COBOL logic in terms of copybooks and overlays lends itself nicely to hierarchical data stores. And then in the 70s, COD came up with this transformative paper, which was really along the lines of, you shouldn't need to know how to get the data in order to get the data. You know, data could be expressed more along the lines of in terms of mathematical algebra. And so then we had relational databases, and Oracle was the first, but you know, many followed and have all been incredibly successful.
Go Larry Ellison.
That was the rise of SQL. And then we led into the fall. And the fall was more the fact that as the internet just absolutely exploded, technologies could scale to a certain amount, which probably could easily accommodate 99% of the world's data requirements. But for those niche players who were like dealing with billions of users and petabytes of data, relational technology maybe wasn't there for that yet. And so it's funny how the first, what people call them NoSQL systems, but really they were just non-relational systems, came into play. And what I always chuckle at is the first iterations of those were key value stores. It was literally like going back to the 60s. And unsurprisingly, people found all those same complexities in terms of dealing with key value stores. And so we moved on to hierarchical systems, just like we did in the 70s. And then people started building systems on them. That's why you can see the, I suppose, one of the reasons for the explosion of JSON, in the sense that it's a hierarchical system, much like XML. And then finally,
sorry, Connor, just to ask you, so this is all, so when you say this, that the relational database could handle structured data, what we're talking about here is all the unstructured data, right? Photos, videos, whatever else.
I don't think so. The relational database, even as far back as Oracle 7, the relational database has always been capable of dealing with unstructured data. I think it was more the volume and intensity. So I know people talk about the 4 V's of big data. Was it the velocity, variety, veracity?
Volume, something. I don't know. I
For me, you can look it up. Yeah, there's 4 V's. I should know them.
I have come across it. I just can't remember it, like most things.
But I found I never really bought into that except for the volume argument. And it's generally true that there are limits to relational database technology, and that's really a reflection of the way it evolved, in the sense that in the days when relational databases were becoming incredibly popular, the entire motivation of handling server capacity was bigger. So you had a small server, it ran out of capacity, you got a bigger one. That ran out of capacity, you got a bigger one. And so software reflected that. Software reflected the fact that generally you ran databases on a single server that you got bigger and bigger. Probably the exception to that was our Oracle RAC, which was clustered, but still ran on the concept of a shared disk system. So I think software follows hardware, and as hardware basically found it actually couldn't scale forever when things like the internet came along, it was those limitations that people then needed to work around. And so it was more the fact that people said, well, if I'm a startup, I can't go buy a monstrous great server. What I'll do is I'll get several servers and use software to try and work around the fact that I actually have multiple things now to manage. And that's see things like DynamoDB, Cassandra, Hadoop, all really coming from the Google file system, because they were really the pioneers of trying to present lots of little servers as one.
Okay, so is this just so when you were talking, I'm just thinking, just in the back of my mind. So in my earlier engineering days, we had the concepts of, certainly in the world of mainframes, when you talk about COBOL and some of that, you had the concept of virtual machines, and I just find it interesting that we've come back to many of those concepts. So is this so? Are we just kind of building off those same concepts and advancing, or is it? I mean, what's your take on that?
I think always solutions always come to problems. Sorry, let me start that again. I think solutions that come out of problems generally stand the test of time. And don't get me wrong, I'm not being critical of NoSQL solutions. They certainly have their place. And if you have reached the limits of what you can do with a relational database, then going to a NoSQL is a natural evolution. It's one of the reasons I'm sure that we now have a sharding offering inside Oracle, in the sense that if you need to geographically distribute for reasons of either robustness or latency or just scale, you can actually sharded version of the Oracle database. But I think the good solutions come as a result of hitting an obstacle. Google couldn't find a database big enough to handle the explosion of internet, and so they built their own, let's call it database, the big file system to manage that. Where I see the danger of this cyclical nature is people who build solutions for problems that don't actually exist yet. And one of the things there is I'm always amazed at the amount of people who, I've seen blog posts where people say, oh yes, we're at our customer site, we've reached nearly 500 transactions per second now, and our server can't cope. So we're moving to technology X away from technology Y. And it's one of those strange things where you look at the technology they're currently on, and if it's Oracle or it's Postgres or any other relational technology, often I'm sitting there going, 500 transactions per second. We could rattle off 1,000 customers that do at least 10 times that amount without a problem, without any dramas. So generally, it's amazing how people often view their own shortcomings, whether they've not coded an application correctly, or whether they're not using the technology correctly, or whether they haven't done good database design, etc. Often the own shortcomings in terms of approaching a problem, they go, oh, it's an issue with the technology. We need to move to a new technology. Now, don't get me wrong, that keeps you and I and things like that employed often. But yeah, generally, it's amazing how when people come up against obstacles, they think, a new technology is the solution. So it's funny. There was a quote. Let me think. There's a new product that's being touted by some people who I think used to work for YouTube. I think it's, what's it called? It might be called Planet Scale. They're coming up with a distributed relational database in the same flavor, I suppose, as things like Yugabyte and stuff like that. But it's funny how one of the quotes one of the founders says is, relational is the ideal solution for all cases, except where it can't do the job. And he said, if YouTube, or if relational technologies could have handled the incredible growth in things like YouTube and Google and stuff like that, none of these NoSQL solutions would have ever been invented. The problem wouldn't have existed. No one would have ever invented these NoSQL solutions. So NoSQL solutions are almost desperately trying to get to the level of functionality that's been in the relational database world forever. They have, don't get me wrong, it's not because they're immature, it's more that they have extra challenges because they need to do it at a global scale. But the reality is, you're a database practitioner of any technology. If you don't need to be at global scale, then you should follow the lead of the people who are doing NoSQL solutions, in that they're saying, until you need to go to one of these solutions, go with a relational database for all the benefits.
So Connor, when you're speaking, one of the things that's kind of spinning in my mind, and again, this is not, obviously this is Connor talking and not Oracle, is I'm always kind of amazed, but when we talk about big data and everything, and I'm just thinking, where does this end? Like, when we talk about, you can take Moore's law or Metcalfe's law, or I don't know what the law for storage is. I mean, does this just keep on infinitely scaling as time goes on, or do we hit a wall someplace? Like, what's your personal take on that?
I don't think it's going to slow down anytime soon. I saw a quote recently. It's an old quote now. It's from Eric Schmidt, the Google CEO. And I remember he said, what was it? This might have been in 2010, but he said, more data was produced in the last week than has in the history of time before last week.
Wow.
In terms of growth. Now, I'm not sure if that trend has continued, but I'm sure, I saw something recently on the internet, which is a water bottle you can buy, like for going to the gymnasium and stuff. And it's Wi-Fi enabled, because it will send your phone a message telling you when you need to drink more or when the water bottle is empty. And I'm saying, we have survived as a human species with, using a remarkable piece of technology to work out when a water bottle is empty. You pick it up and you look at it, or you shake it. So I think the world will continue to find data generation solutions even when no such requirement was needed.
It goes back to your point about finding solutions to real problems as opposed to manufactured ones.
That's right. So I think as long as there exists the concept at the moment, which is where there's data to be stored, there's money to be made. I think data solution, data growth will continue. What I do think will happen though is, I think the data capture rate will slow eventually, not because of some sort of limit. I think people will start to become far more protective of the data they're willing to share. I think we've seen, over the last couple of years, people now have it used to be the case that, company X got hacked and the general public would sort of laugh about it. Whereas now the general public is much more informed about the importance of data, the importance of security of data. And so they have a much more vested interest in what they're prepared to offer up and how it's been protected. You can see the recent bans of various, phone apps in various countries around the world. Obviously, TikTok's probably the most publicly notable one. People are starting to realize that, data generation isn't necessarily such a great thing all the time. Okay.
And by the way, while I'm speaking, I have to compliment you that the backdrop that you have behind you is like a perfect setting. I mean, everything just looks in place, and it looks like a beautiful studio, or I don't know how to even put it into words.
Well, rest assured, this is not my place. It's not a virtual background. I'm just in a family member's house.
Okay.
They have far more discipline in terms of keeping their house in a nice state than I would be prepared to share with my house. Certainly when we do things at my home, generally I put myself in a corner where you can only see a set of shelves, or I put a virtual background out. So,
but that too is a great background, by the way, because I have talked to you with that background also.
I have reasonable confidence, David, in that you are not currently on a hill over Golden Gate Bridge.
That is correct. Astute observation. So on that note, one final thought. So I mean, this is obviously this conversation is going on while the Yatra tour is going on, even though it's virtual. So obviously last year it was in person and you actually did the tour. I'm sure you have many memories of it because you visited so many cities in such a short time space. Is there like one memory you'd like to that you'd like to share, just for nostalgia purposes?
Sure. Well enough, and don't get me wrong, I don't want to cast any shade on the events themselves when we're there. But I figured if I mentioned one of the particular events and anything from one event, that's being dismissive of all the others. So I'm going to share a memory, which is actually one of the days off we had, which was it was pouring with rain. And Sarah took us on a lovely drive to the country. We ended up at this dam, which was overflowing. And what was amazing was, normally as Westerners, it's raining, we sort of go, oh God, it's raining, and we grumble and we grizzle. And yet, I can't remember exactly where we were, but we went out to this dam and it was absolutely packed to the rafters. It was just people sitting there in the flow of the water as it came over the dam with the rains opening. Obviously, none of these people knew us, and yet they would consistently come up and say hi and look at the weather, and they'd be huge smiles on their faces. And that's one of, I think, the real tragedies when you think about the COVID situation is the ability for people just spontaneously to come together in groups and celebrate something. These people were just celebrating the fact that it was raining and the dam was overflow, and it was just beautiful. It's just a real outpouring of just sheer happiness. That's one of the things I miss from Yatra from last year. And on similar levels, even at the events themselves, the enthusiasm of the attendees, the bonds you make with the other speakers. I'm hoping that one day we'll be back face to face, because virtual events are great, but they never ever replace that enthusiasm that you can get face to face.
Absolutely. And with that, Connor, I'll offer you my finger. If you can see it, I don't know where, but I like to make that human connection, but it'll have to be virtual for now. And I can't even seem to get my finger in the frame here for some reason, but it's meant to be there. Connor, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for sharing.
All right. See you. Take care, Javid. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.